Get ready to travel back in time to the year 1381, where we'll explore one of the most remarkable rebellions in English history, the Peasants Revolt. It all started in 1348, when the Black Death swept through Europe, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Fast forward to 1381, and things still weren't looking up for the peasants. The economic laws enforced at the time made their lives even more miserable than a Monday morning commute. It was like the universe was playing a sick joke on them, but they were seething with resentment instead of laughing. But let's be real, who can blame the peasants for revolting? I mean, if I had to choose between a life of backbreaking labor and starvation or starting a revolution, I know which one I'd choose. So grab your pitchforks and torches, and let's go back in time to witness the epic Peasants Revolt. Welcome to Untold History Guy, where you can find fun, fascinating, and sometimes shocking chronicles of history. Join us as we journey back and uncover the untold truths of the past. The Black Death. It all started back in the day, 1348 to be exact, when the Grim Reaper came knocking and wiped out almost half of the population of Europe. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, but it wasn't easy. There was a severe shortage of labor, and those who were willing to work were charging way more. And forget about finding a good deal on food. Prices were skyrocketing faster than a cannonball. To make matters worse, some folks were taking advantage of the situation by grabbing up land left and right. It was like musical chairs, except instead of chairs, it was land, and instead of music, it was the sound of peasants crying. To keep the peasants in their place and maintain social hierarchy, the Parliament issued new labor laws that regulated wages and made sure the poor stayed poor. Talk about keeping people down. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there were rumors of political corruption and religious tensions, making everything feel like a medieval version of Game of Thrones. It was all too much for the peasants to bear, so they rebelled. Unpopular government policies. After the Black Death, the ruling class responded to the devastating pandemic by passing laws to keep peasants in their place. The Parliament enforced new labor laws to regulate wages and maintain a strong labor force. And they reinforced the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which Edward III had laid out. The basis of this law was to put a stop to peasants' demands for better pay and force them to stick to their social class. Of course, these laws had unintended consequences. The ruling class unwittingly created a hotbed of resentment and rebellion by making it nearly impossible for peasants to leave their hometowns to find better paying work. Because when you take away people's hope for a better future, they tend to get a little cranky. That resentment led them to rebel and demand better laws to be enforced. War. The 100 Years' War that began in 1337, when Edward III pressed his claim against the French government, contributed majorly to the revolt. This war was like getting a root canal without anesthesia. Of course, the peasants were the ones who really got the short end of the stick in the whole mess. They were forced to fight in the war, which meant leaving their families and homes to face all sorts of dangers, from enemy attacks to disease and starvation. When they weren't fighting, they were being taxed to pay for the war, because nothing says thank you for your service like making people pay for the privilege of almost getting killed. They were displaced as their boats were repossessed and their towns invaded and attacked by the French Navy. This period saw the French Navy raiding English islands, ships, and towns. Many villages and houses were destroyed by fire, with areas like Kent, Essex, Southampton, and even Portsmouth facing significant attack and damage. Many people were killed, and others were captured to work as slaves. Those who were captured as slaves were often left to the mercy of their attackers because their government responded inefficiently to the demands made by the attackers. The higher social classes became increasingly politicized. The southeast part of the country faced a lot of destruction, which led to further dissatisfaction. The 100 Years' War was a real treat for everyone involved, except for the peasants, who were left to deal with the consequences of a war they never asked for. And because they were the ones feeling the heavy burden of the war, they expressed their feelings through the famous Peasants' Revolt. Poll tax. Welcome to medieval England, where even a devastating war can't stop the ruling class from squeezing peasants for every penny they're worth. This war led to the treasury being bankrupt, and the barons were fed up with paying for the war. John of Gaunt decided that the best way to pay for the 100 Years' War was to make the poor people pay for it. Because who needs a progressive tax system when you can just burden the peasants with an extra tax on top of all the other taxes they already can't afford? Of course, the barons were thrilled with this idea. Finally, they could sit back and let the peasants foot the bill for their lavish lifestyles. And when the government realized how much money they could make off the backs of the poor, they decided to repeat the implementation 3 more times, just for good measure. These taxes made life for the peasants even harder, as they could hardly afford to live comfortably in the harsh economic conditions that were prevailing then, lest they pay the heavy taxes. To make matters worse, these taxes were collected in cash and not in the form of farm produce. Many started evading these taxes by hiding from tax collectors and later found the courage to join the rebellion that would free them. All in all, the poll tax was a real hit with the ruling class, but for the peasants it was just another way to make their already difficult lives even more miserable. But hey, at least it gave them something to rebel against, right? The Thomas Bampton outbreak. Thomas Bampton, the tax collector who thought he could squeeze blood from a turnip. Little did he know, he was about to get squeezed himself. John the Gaunt, the head of the royal council, sent out collectors to squeeze the peasants for more money like they were a bunch of giant lemons. But when Thomas showed up in Fobbing, he was met with a group of angry villagers who were sour. They had already paid their taxes, and now they were being asked to pay for those who had been slacking off. That was the last straw for the villagers, and they beat Thomas and his cronies. The royal council then sent Robert Belknap to mediate, but he must have forgotten his bulletproof vest because he suffered the same fate as Thomas. The rebellion spread like wildfire, with peasants turning against their landowners and houses burning faster than a 4th of July fireworks display. And those records of labor duties, taxes, and debts, well, they went up in flames like a Tinder date gone wrong. The rebellion even spread to other parts of the country, with landowners running for the hills like they were being chased by a horde of angry bees. And some of them even got down on their hands and knees and acted as servants, which just goes to show you that karma is a dish best served with a side of rebellion. This motivated other peasants to join, which ultimately led to the Peasants Revolt. The Church. In a vulnerable state, you would want the church to side with you, but that was not the case this time. The peasants must have felt like they were in a real-life episode of Game of Thrones, with the church choosing the side of the enemy. And if that wasn't bad enough, the clergy seemed to be suffering from some serious brain fog, with their lack of education making people lose faith in them faster than a toddler loses interest in a toy. It's like the church forgot its own teachings about helping the less fortunate and instead decided to cozy up to the landowners who were probably stuffing their faces with cheese and wine while the peasants were starving. Thankfully, there were still a few good eggs in the clergy, like John Ball, who stood up for the peasants and paid the price with his arrest. It just goes to show that even in the darkest of times, there are still people who will fight for what's right, even if it means going against their own kind. His arrest and the unstable religious environment instilled more resentment among the peasants, fueling the revolt. Emerging dissent in both urban and rural communities. It seems like the government just couldn't catch a break. Even before the official peasant revolt, protests were popping up left and right, with folks in both urban and rural areas giving the government some serious side-eye. People in southern countries like Sussex, Kent, and Essex were already ticked off about serfdom, thanks in part to the teachings of the one and only John Ball. John was a real rebel. He'd preached to villagers in secret, trying to light a fire under them to stand up against the church and the government. But even with John's sermons, economic conditions just kept getting worse, and people were getting really fed up. The last straw came when John Hampden was sent to Fobbing to collect unpaid taxes. Instead of a warm welcome, he got a violent reception, and that's when the official revolt began. Sure, the peasants didn't get what they wanted in the end, and most of them were crushed and executed, but the landowners were still shaking in their boots. The government may have won the battle, but the peasants definitely won some street cred. So, what's your take on the cause of the Peasants' Revolt? Which one blew your mind away? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to check out our other videos for more entertaining content.